Hey, my friends. It's nice to see you again. So I thought maybe today we would just go for a nice walk down Paseo De Reforma. I hope everything's going good with you. Now, I've had some difficult days, but everything's okay. Thank God for another day. So, coming down Paseo De Reforma, it's maybe one of the most important streets in Mexico. Today it's, God, it must be 30 skyscrapers. But there was a time where there were no skyscrapers, and this was practically the private road of a guy named Maximilian. Today, look at that modern, beautiful sunshine. But there was a time where, I think it was the 1840s, and Maximilian had been brought over by some European powers to be the king. He thought he won an election, but he did not. And the story ends with his head being cut off, or being shot, and his wife returning to Europe, and Benito Juarez becoming president again. But there was a time where this road was just his. And it's different at that time. In fact, he never even finished it this far. His house or castle was a couple miles back, and this road goes to the government, the Zocalo, the town square, town center. Over time, the road, Paseo De Reforma, which was originally named in honor of his wife, it became fancy like this. The stock market, U.S. Embassy. But back then it was just carriages instead of cars. Now the city is 24 million. And it's quieter than normal because of the pandemic, and things are changing, and for a lot of people times are really difficult. From what I understand, there's 70 statues like that. The weird thing about those statues is that they really don't connect with the people very well. I'm not a super expert, right? But I don't know who most of them are, if any of them. I heard one writer, he wrote, the statues on Paseo De Reforma show you that the winners write the history. But for a long time now, Benito Juarez took over power in, I think, the 1860s, 1870s. And this street has been part of the continual regrowth of the city, maybe rebranding of the city. since about the 2000s or 2010. The skyscrapers have gone up and the beautiful buildings, modern buildings, but sometimes I like to imagine the more simple version. When I look at pictures from 100 years ago, Paseo De Reforma was even greener and even wider, and there wasn't that much traffic. And I know today it doesn't look like that much traffic, but often it's just bumper to bumper, especially before the pandemic, before COVID. But probably no other street in Mexico. And it's one of those streets in the world that has the longest and most interesting historical growth. The story that it tells is one of continuous new presidents and then dictators and then presidents, then dictators, or really dictator, president, dictators. I think today we kind of forget how historic and important Paseo De Reforma is. I believe that's in honor of miners who died in a mining accident. Las Palmas, the intersection of Las Palmas. And this is the stock market. They have the ticker tape up there. I think a lot of Americans forget that stock markets around the world. This one's pretty beautiful. I don't know how its value is. The peso needs to get stronger, but it's a beautiful building. I believe these benches on the side are the originals. I think they've been there for 120 years, maybe 70, but you have wide sidewalks, places to sit along the whole route. Then you have these amazing skyscrapers. We don't see it in this walk, but down the street on Paseo de Reforma is the largest skyscraper in all of Latin America, Torre Mayor. But now there's 2 or 3 that are almost just as big, right next to it. Normally having that many ambulances means emergency happened, but in Mexico City sometimes they play their sirens simply because it's a formation or a practice or what have you. So I was kind of wondering, but they stopped at the next stoplight, turn off those sirens, and then turn them back on when the stoplight turns green. Mexico City is one of those places where you get used to all the sirens and all the noise. It's part of the ambiance. There was a time when obviously when Paseo De Reforma was first made in the 1840s or 60s, there was no such thing as sidewalks. Carriages and people walked together. In some ways, we still walk this way in Mexico City, but through the streets, and then the cars will go around you. But when they first put in the sidewalks, later on they put in all that green on the side, all the kind of the plants there, but it was as a way to kind of not have so much space to walk. And it's beautiful, but I kind of wonder, like, what would it be like to have a 65-foot sidewalk, 70-foot sidewalk? Mexico is nice because one of the reasons is these very wide sidewalks. You have space. Now, it's not this way everywhere, but here in the working district, they've made it so that you have a lot of space. Paseo De Reforma is really popular for different types of protests. It's normally where almost all the protests are, and some are pretty serious, like the one on the left here. These are 43 young people, I think college age, who were part of some type of protest movement. And one day they disappeared. And there's a lot of suspicion from a lot of people that somewhere in the government is the responsibility. This protest has been camping out here for maybe, is it 10 years? I don't know if this lady's part of it, but these are the great salespeople of the streets of Mexico. I loved the taxi. So for years they've been looking for information, and they're camping there to demand that the information comes out. Who killed these 43? Who made them disappear?
Ya, barrida y todo.
But there's so many protests in Mexico that sometimes you run the risk of, for instance, they've been living there for 3,000 days. I think the sign says like 2,700 days, 3,200 days. They've hit the point where, they could be ignored because, one, there's so many other protests, and those protests are just like theirs. So sometimes protest movements can kind of get lost in the shuffle of Mexico City. But you have to give them credit. People are allowed to protest, and they just took over that area of the sidewalk, and that was it. It's been there for 7 years. There's an area at UNAM that's been under occupation from protesters for like 42 years. Sometimes to us Americans that's crazy, but if you're going to talk about freedom, well, I think that Mexico would say that's part of it. The inconveniences of freedom. Sometimes for Americans, the thing that they have the hardest time getting used to is actually the freedom here in Mexico. We're very used to a very well-regulated society as opposed to a free society. We'll see parks like this going all the way up to the Zocalo. I just admire the painting here at the hostel, and you can see the Cobra Kai advertisement was painted to the wall next to it. The street we're about to cross, the one we're looking at right now, is called Insurgentes, the really big street, not the one where the cars turn in my left. Insurgentes is one of the longest streets in the world. I believe it's part of the Trans Highway, the Transcontinental Highway that goes, forgive me if I'm saying that wrong, but it goes from like Canada to Argentina. And this particular street, and it goes to the whole city, of course, but I think it's maybe 600 miles long each way. When Paseo De Reforma and Insurgentes first crossed, that time frame from then until maybe the 60s, this road kind of represented right here where poor people stopped living and where the more affluent lived. As Mexico City has grown from 1 million people to 5 million to 12 million to now 24 million, working class neighborhoods exist on the peripheral outside the whole city. But this was kind of the marker for that for a long time. One reason is that over here is the Senate. The government bodies are all connected to the street. And of course, that's partially because of the original plan. Well, it's a little more complicated. It wasn't all Maximilian. Part of it was that what we're looking at now was the outskirts of the Mexica. Their society was towards the Zocalo. And that was government, just one government replaced another in the exact same area. And then out this way was more of the outskirts, the park, Chapultepec Park, where remember there was rivers everywhere at one time, up until 1900s, I think, maybe 1700s. But then they filled all the rivers with cement to make it more modern. It's one of the great crimes. The city really is just like Venice in Italy. And then they covered it all up. But I don't want to be too anti-modern. Of course, they wanted to become a world-class economy. It's one of the great cities in the world. It's like New York, but with hot sauce. It's like if you combine New York and Los Angeles and then pour their hot sauce over everything. So in the patio of the Senate, there was another protest where they took over the land, but this one really blew my mind. This was marijuana activists. They were throwing some 420 parties, I think, and then they just never left. And then they put up these fences, and now you can see them doing their horticulture with, they must have 40 or 50 plants, 4-foot, 5-foot, 6-foot plants of marijuana. And as an American, where we have so much law and order, it really does blow my mind that they're in the country's Senate patio. Now, Mexico has legalized almost all forms of recreational marijuana. So I'm not always sure what they're protesting. ¿No grabes? Perdón. Acá. Showing off my spectacular Spanish. So he was telling me not to record there. But again, I got to give Mexico a lot of credit. When I said, like, yeah, there, or I'll record over that way. Then he was like, yeah, no problem. But I do wonder about protest movements these days. When you walk by that area, I'm happy, I believe in legalization of marijuana. But then when I walk by that area, it's a really tough area compared to other places. Like all of a sudden there's protesters with their, kind of like it's their group, it's their clique, and it's a little more aggressive. And I wonder if sometimes protesters, they're given, they have the Senate patio, but it still turns into kind of an us versus them. And I think often protesters are really addicted to the emotion of protesting, right? So, they're selling drugs outside of the Senate, but they're still really kind of like suspicious. but it's technically legal. And so it shows kind of a cultural leaning towards anger and suspicion. And that's just something I was thinking about. You can see the Mexican flag is chiseled into that wall up there. It's beautiful. This is the country senate, where the legislators and the laws are passed, and it still surprises me that their senate has a marijuana farm that's taken over their patio. But I think a lot of people would say give credit to Mexicans for caring more about the people than about controlling. Here, law and order doesn't mean controlling others. There's a lot more of give and take. This might be because in 1968 there was a giant massacre. Mexico was different. They were about to have the Olympics. They really were a very, very successful country. They're being called the Mexican miracle. The peso was strong. And some protesters who were communists were protesting. The police at a place called Tlatelolco, or Plaza de Culturas. Most people say they killed 300 people. A lot of it's on video. The government never acknowledged more than 30 people. But they were in the windows looking down on the square. They shot down. I think that scarred the country very, very much. So today, they try to be much more careful with how they react to protests. This area, from what I understand, is the area that was first Paseo De Reforma. Then it went to Las Palmas, the intersection of the palm trees. But this really was the only part that was finished, even in the days where it was a dirt street. There was no hotels or anything. Famous taco carts and tamale carts and dulce sweets carts. If I would give anyone advice, if you can, if you're going to go for a walk or come to Mexico and then you just want to go for a walk, because it is a walk-in city, just walk until you're hungry and then pick that place that's nearest to you. The taco carts are fine. The flavor is great, and the best part about eating here in Mexico at those little carts is the community, the friendship, there's some kind of bonding that occurs as people just kind of stand and read it. It's one of the most special cultural aspects of Mexico.
Amigo, ¿te leo las cartas?
You don't see it too well here, but that building, it turns in like a horseshoe, and I think it's beautiful architecture. This statue, it was one of the first two statues on Paseo De Reforma. It was of Christopher Columbus, but he has since been taken down by the government. And although I tend to believe in, that history is history, he did cut off an entire island's worth of people's hands and feet in search for gold. It may be acceptable to just say that's not the values we're looking to promote. But it's interesting that he was one of the first two. A lot of times people compare Paseo de Reforma to that famous street in Paris, and it's actually built a similar way. And Mexico City did have, and maybe it still does, but it had like this fetish with Europe, and they built streets that were like, what's it, Campos LSC? I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. This beautiful hotel, been there forever. And so they modeled Paseo de Reforma after France. And I think a lot of people rightfully say that, Mexico is beautiful all by itself. Like if you go into other neighborhoods and you have what we consider more indigenous Mexicano culture, there's a special vibration there that isn't even here. But they were invaded by the European cultures. France particularly tried to, I think it was Napoleon that put Maximilian in charge. And then there seemed to be an idea that they needed to be more European to be successful. And that lasted till maybe the 30s or 40s. Maybe the 70s, I don't know. Maybe today. That's kind of the cultural push and pull of Mexico City, is where do you stop respecting European culture without letting go of your own culture? Giving in. How do you combine them in a way that's equal? Trying to show how the building has all the barbed wire at the front. There's been a lot more conflicts here over the last few years, so we've seen things like that. Starting these videos, I'm worried both that I'm going to talk too little and that I'm going to talk too much. Maybe I'll quiet down for a little bit. I want you to enjoy your walk here, not just listen to me for an hour and a half. Perdóname. This was originally the beginning of Paseo De Reforma. Where that El Caballito used to be a statue, I think, of a Spanish king on a giant horse. And it was a giant statue, very regal. It now sits somewhere in front of a museum, I believe, in the Zocalo or the Zocalo downtown area. And now this art, which is like the translation of a interpretation of a horse's shadow. So downtown gets a lot busier. Gets older, which is actually a really good thing. As we walk downtown, this building here is probably from the 50s. And then we'll get down to the Zocalo, and the buildings will be from like the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. It's great walking through that history. Here we have the graffiti from the radical feminist protesting riots that occurred. They were pretty violent protests. And in some ways, I feel like they really ruined, well, just my opinion, so I respect yours, but I felt like they ruined what was a cause that was moving forward. And they set police on fire. They set the government buildings on fire. They tried to invade the church that was built in the 1570s. It just seemed like all of the support from most citizens kind of said, oh, I agree, Mexico has a problem with violence towards women, murdering women. But when they added trying to murder police to that, it just seemed to take the air out of the movement. There was a famous meme after there was a series of protests. It wasn't just one. They destroyed every monument we passed was destroyed or attacked by them. I don't know. I'd love to hear your opinion too, but I thought I would just talk about things I've seen already. You can kind of see the earlier buildings. I don't know when these were built. It could have been the 60s or 80s. So technically that's Paseo De Reforma, going all the way down that way. We're going to turn right and go towards the Zocalo by Benito Juarez Street, and then Maduro, which is an all walkway. So this is us entering the historical center of the city. And it's been the historical center for 700 years. At first, this was pretty much the same, of course not the same, but the same street layout of the Mexica, the Aztecs. Then when the Spanish invaded in 1519, by 1521, the invasion was for Mexico City pretty complete, and they ruled from here. And at that time, these streets were rivers, and we're in the center of, from this whole time we've been walking, we're in what used to be a giant lake. So now we're going to walk into a more historic area where we're going to look at the streets are being rebuilt since 1570, 1530, 1529, something like that. Mexicans really know how to talk to each other. To say, what happened to Queen? What's happening, Queen? It's a beautiful, beautiful culture here. Notice how she was waiting for him to notice her. Very old church. I'd forget, maybe 1630s, I think, 1700s. Not the oldest church in the area, though. The square used to be just covered with sales tents, but it's actually a park with a monument to the victims of the earthquake of 1985. That earthquake was devastating. Talked to people that lived through it. They said it just never ended. Thousands of buildings fell. And from what I get from this monument is that their hands, or the hands of the people who passed away, are at the root of our existence. And that, of course, that flagpole holds the Mexican flag. Or at least it should. I'm not sure if it actually does. I believe this here is Parque Armenia, or Barrio Armenia. This is where some of the most famous paintings of Diego Rivera were painted and destroyed. Down the street, we're going to see Bellas Artes. If I'm not mistaken, there's that famous caricature called Caterina, where you see her with a big hat and she's a skeleton, and it's kind of the basis for Dia de los Muertos paintings, Day of the Dead paintings, where you paint your face like her skeleton. I believe the journalist was sitting at this park, or in this area, and he saw a woman who dressed so flamboyantly European, and he felt like, wait, we're Mexican. And it makes sense, because like we've been talking about, Paseo De Reforma, and then there's a dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. And they were trying to be European, French, but they were Mexicanos. And so I think this park played a pretty big role in a moment of a flash of creative genius. He drew up picture of the fancy lady in the European clothes, but he made her a skeleton and hit the newspaper and became a cultural icon. Buenas tardes, mi amiga. ¿Cómo estás?
Bien, gracias.
Qué bueno. Showing off my great Spanish again. You know, just showing it off. Really, there is a cultural thing that she represents. So, Mexicans never give up. Most. And you'll find people, wheelchairs. I've seen videos of construction workers with one leg. They get out there and they find a way. And there's a lot that us Americans could learn from Mexicans keeping the energy and the pride of work just always going. This statue really caught my attention when I first saw it, and I looked into it, and I believe it represents the beauty of democracy, but it's handcuffed, and she can't break free.
todo lo de sur, las plazas, las Zocalo. ¿Y a qué hora lo voy a hacer?
So I think I messed up on the editing. I mean, it should have just been a straight walk, but we're now in El Centro, so we took about 7-8 minutes out of the video. These are the streets that are the oldest part of Mexico City, that sit on top of the Aztec Empire that was before this. Here's the Bank of Mexico. You're going to notice a lot of really old buildings. Someday we'll do a video where we look at each of the plaques, but some of the things will, are the very first houses of Spanish lords, the places where Moctezuma lived will be down this street. The church that was built in 1530s or 1570s up into the 1630s. It was originally built with the stones of the Aztec Temple. So we'll just enjoy this little walk. Buenas tardes.
Perdóname,
No, 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 no se preocupe, yo.
Pero mira,
ayer. Dice Gustavo.
Buenas tardes, mi amigo. ¿Cómo estás?
Todo respeto, mi amigo.
Gracias por la
Dios
música.
los bendiga. Saludos. buen
Saludos.
día. Gracias.
So this is the, down at the end here is the church. We'll be walking into the Zocalo. The history of that church is, I mean, it's too much to cover right now, but long story short, in this square is where the Aztecs, the Mexica, had their government and their temples, and they're right around here is the largest trade center for the Mexica. So all the stories you hear about when the Spanish came to Mexico, when Cortez, every story between Cortez and Cuauhtemoc happened in this square. From the first meeting happened maybe a mile and a half, maybe less to the right. At that time, Cortez would have been seeing giant painted temples where everything from human sacrifices to dances occurred. The church is a sore spot for some people, understandably so. It was, as I said before, built with the stones, or at least the first church was built with the stones of the temple that was torn down by the Spanish after the conquest of the Aztecs or the Mexica. It represented not only a church to pray to Mother Mary and Jesus, but the complete conquering of another person's gods. And we can look back now and I think we can see the cruelty and we can see the inevitability of it. The government still has its main offices. That far building to the far right is the government buildings. It is quite an experience that I suggest you do someday. There's a few events in history, as we walk through the police taking that guy's stuff. There's a few events in history that are more important than Cortez and Cuauhtemoc and what happened in this area. It's been rebuilt many times. There's not a mural, but an example of all the different ways that the buildings have been built from the 1500s when the Mexica were the government to today. It's in the Metro Zocalo. But right here, over 700 years of history and power has sat.
Vale, servicio. Vale, Suárez. Dos, toca yo nada más, güey. Dos.
Porque no estoy en la tarde todavía.
Vale, servicio.
¿Quién es Zócalo? ¿Puedo ir allá, no? Ah, entonces está. Llego ahí. Metro, Villa de Cortés, ¿ah? Ahorita te caigo.
Es lo que se cooperar, jóvenes, cualquier manera. Que no se pierda la tradición, jóvenes. Es lo que se cooperar, la tradición.
Buenas tardes, señor.
De repente falla mejor.
Libro educativo para que niños puedan escribir. A sumar está el color de 10 pesos. Bonito regalo para niños, los niños te valen 10. Te valen a 10, te valen a 10 pesos. Llévate el libro para que le valga 10 pesos.
Ya hay don Juan Tenorio, ya empezando a trabajar. Ya hay paso. Ay, sí me dijo que...
No quería que pase, porque hay una gente que se pone así una torreta.
Guatemala. Es Guatemala, esquina.
And this is Templo Mayor. This was the early, from what I understand, an intimidating and spectacular area of temples and religious buildings. Time and the Spanish tore it down, but we're lucky to have this. It was completely covered until the 1960s. I believe when they were getting ready for the Olympics, a person was digging a pipeline to create a better water flow, and they found some amazing artifact, which then became this UNESCO historic site. The original government power structure of the Aztecs, the Mexica. And it shows you how complete the conquest was, that people said they did not know that it existed until 1960s, when the rumor that it existed was found to be true. And to this day in El Centro, numerous amazing artifacts are found, and archaeologists are digging in this area all the time. For me, that building that we're coming up on, that's the one that I find most penetrates my heart. It was in that building that, when you read the history books, right there, I hope I zoom in, or when Cortez had gone away for a little bit, his men decided that it was time just to take care of this. So in there was people dancing, and it must have been an amazing dance to their gods, trying to figure out, what are these invaders, these foreigners doing here? Why has our king given up so much power to them? He's a god. So they went in with their swords. No one else had any weapons, and they massacred every single person. And there are historic accounts from the Spanish of the absolute horror of the event. It was that event from that building that created the complete upvolt and rebellion of the Mexica, where they fought a war with Cortez. They lost it, but we have to always recognize that they were fighting weapons that they had not seen before, and that they had figured out those weapons really well. And had it not been for a pandemic that killed something like 80% of the population, maybe Mexico City would still be Mexica completely. Well, I'm new to this, so I hope you enjoyed my little walk, and I hope I didn't talk too much. We'll get together soon. Have a wonderful day.